meditation being pretty compelling. Jennifer, I think you made the comment that, if there's all this data, we should all be doing it, right? So I want to share a little bit more about that with you. But before we do, I'd like to first introduce you to two ways of thinking about how to practice. And we've already started doing this with you today. There are these practices that are integrated that you do in the moment. Things like the micro practices, like the 3 breaths that we did. That's an example of a micro practice, and we're going to share several more with you through the program. Those are things you do throughout the day, just when you notice maybe you need to take a break. Maybe you're noticing that you're feeling frustrated. Maybe you're noticing any number of things, and we'll give you a lot of tools to do that with. The other kind of practice is what we'll call dedicated practice. And you can think of this like being in the gym, right? So we work out in the gym so that we can show up and be able to do more things physically with our bodies, right? And so we're doing the same kind of training and practice with our brains through a dedicated practice. And a dedicated practice can often be through a practice like meditation, right? So when we're thinking of dedicated practice, we're thinking of things like meditation. And I'll give you a definition here from Julie Broucek-Lewis. She describes meditation as this family of mental training practices that are designed to familiarize the practitioner, which is us, with specific types of mental processes, right? So several different ways. There's not just one, there's not one simple process, there's a number of different ones that we'll discover. And this is a graph that shows what's been happening with mindfulness research. Specifically, if you look here, this is around the year 2000, and here we're around 2015. So in that period of time, the research in mindfulness and meditation has really exploded. And it's pretty exciting because there's a lot of data that's starting to become available for the first time. And we're going to share a little bit of that with you. A lot of the research that's been done centers around neuroplasticity, which is about the brain being able to change function and structure based on where we focus our attention, right? So if we're meditating, we're focusing our attention in a different way, and that has an impact on the structure and function of our brains, and therefore how we show up, how we engage with people. And I want to share a couple different scientific studies with you to give you a little bit more of the evidence behind all of this that I think is pretty interesting and compelling. So Brewer and his colleagues did a study. Basically what they were trying to find out was what's the connection between mindfulness and our ability to pay attention, right? To be focused, and then mind wandering. How does all of that connect? Is there really an impact on focused attention related to meditation and mindfulness? And so they studied the default mode network of the brain, which is this part of our brain that's active when we're mind wandering. And they call it the default mode network because it's what's most alive when you're just laying there waiting for an experiment to begin. Maybe you're laying on the fMRI machine and your brain is sort of jumping all over the place. You can see all these colored regions in this map of the brain over here, and that's sort of what the brain does, right? It's sort of jumping all over the place. It can also be that self-referential thinking, kind of like what Dan Harris was talking about in the video. We're obsessing about ourselves, thinking about ourselves. And so what they found was that when they had people meditating, that mind-wandering part of the brain was actually much less active. The other thing that they found was even when people weren't meditating, people who had a practice of meditation had greater connectivity with the parts of the brain that are related to attention and focus. So they were better able to pay attention and focus even when they weren't meditating, right? So that's pretty powerful to consider. And then there was another study, which I think is also really interesting. This one is by Lutz and his colleagues. And here they were looking at what's the impact of meditation on our stress response. How does it actually affect our stress response? Does it help? Is there really any data to support that? And so the part of the brain, and we'll get into this in more detail later, but the part of the brain that's associated with the stress response is the amygdala. It's part of the salience network, which means things that are salient to us, either they're rewards or they're dangers, those kinds of things that come into our awareness are sensed by the salience network in the brain. And the amygdala is that basal reptilian brain that senses when something like that that's salient to us is happening, a threat or a reward. And so they looked at novice meditators and experienced meditators, and they found some really interesting data. They used something that's called a thermode, and a thermode is a small device that heats up, and you can use it to give a short zap or a short shock to your skin. So they used this thermode, and they were shocking the forearms of the participant. And it didn't cause any lasting damage or anything like that, but it was uncomfortable enough that nobody really enjoys having that done, right? So what they found, the blue here are the novice meditators. What they found was that the novice meditators had a lot of anticipatory stress. They were worried before it ever even happened about what was going to happen, right? They were anxious about it. Whereas the experienced meditators did not experience that. So pretty staggering difference. And then there's also this idea of how long does the pain linger afterwards. And so again, for the novice meditators, fairly substantial lingering of that pain. So sort of feeling badly after that thermode shock, right? Whereas the experienced meditators had far less unpleasantness afterwards. And so what we might conclude from that is that through a practice of meditation, we might be able to reduce our anxiety or our stress in advance of things, our worry that comes up for us, and be able to be better able to recover more quickly and be more resilient. And then there are these things that are called meta-analyses, which are studies of studies. And it's when you start to have these studies of studies that are coming to the same kinds of conclusions that you can start to say, okay, we really have some significant data to consider here, and many people are finding the same kinds of results. So this was some research that was done by Tang and his colleagues, and what they found was that there were 3 key areas where the studies that have been done showed benefits. And the first was related to attentional control, which you can think of as focus, right? Our ability to focus. And so the research, the studies of studies show that this is something that meditation actually helps to increase. The second is emotion regulation. Our ability when we get triggered by something, not to get caught up in it, but to actually be able to move into more productive strategies moving forward. And then the third is self-awareness, right? Just knowing ourselves, knowing our strengths, weaknesses, resources, intuitions, all of those kinds of things about ourselves. So these are 3 key areas that this program is built around as well, right? So we'll do more in each of these areas so that you can not just see what the data says in these studies, but experience it personally and decide for yourself what you think works. There's also some data just from this program here at Search Inside Yourself. And so what I want to say is that, sometimes we think to ourselves, I gave a couple examples where you're comparing a novice meditator and somebody who's an experienced meditator. So how much practice do we need before we start having positive results, right? But I think what you can tell yourselves is that here, when we look at this data, you don't necessarily need years and years of practice to start reaping positive rewards. So what this shows here on the left is that we measured pre and post program, including the 28 days. We measured self-reported ability to take the perspective of another person during a conflict situation, right? So you can see on the left, pre-program, and on the right, post-program. So there was a significant increase that participants reported, and this was in 2015. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see pre-program being better able to pause before reacting. And again, that capacity increased significantly. So participants found these two great benefits, being able to take the perspective of another and to be able to pause before reacting. And if you think about what that might be like in our work worlds and in the world at large, if people could just do those two things more, I think it's pretty compelling, right? And I also want to be realistic with you about the fact that this research is still very much in its infancy. I'm sure that 10 years from now, there will be so much more that we will be able to rely on. And I look forward to that. I think it's also something for all of us in the room to be paying attention to. What can we learn from the science behind it? I think a lot of people know things intuitively for a long time, and this is, many of these practices are not new at all. And yet, having the science to back it up, for a lot of people, that can make it be just that much more real. And I'm curious, just in the room, to understand who's here, how many of you would identify as having a fairly established meditation practice? Okay, great. So we do have a number of people in the room. And what about those of you that would say more towards the beginning of exploring? Okay. And everyone else somewhere in between, right? So we have a good mix in the room between people who have experience with meditation and some who are just developing, and all of that is welcome and encouraged. I think even when you're in a training like this, there's an opportunity, if you are an experienced meditator, to come with kind of a beginner's mind and consider, how can I look at this in a fresh new way? And so we want to explore this, as I mentioned, a little bit more personally, and we're going to start by looking at two different ways of thinking about attention training and how we can do that. So the first form of thinking about attention is the one that we normally think of, which is our ability to focus on a thought or an object that that we're deciding that we want to focus on with our full attention. So that's the first one. And the second is what we'll call meta-attention. Meta-attention is the practice of paying attention to what's happening with our attention. So it's being able to notice when our attention has shifted and we're no longer focusing on something. And that's really the key to being able to concentrate and focus, right? So we want to not just focus on our attention, but we want to focus on this meta-attention. And we're going to work on both of these.